podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis Podcast, officially the second most popular podcast in Great Britain. Well, tennis podcast. It's good enough. Thank you very much for everyone who's helped us get to that very prestigious ranking. I've got loads of 5-star ratings to catch up on, so I apologise if I miss yours. I will read it out next week. I've had one from Tennis Pratt in Ireland, who just says, one of the best podcasts around. Thank you very much, Tennis Pratt. I hope that's not your real name. Your parents might be a bit mean. Love the Pod says, good golly, Miss Polly. Great insights, analysis, and news behind the scenes. Love your sense of humour too. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you. Thank you very much, Polly. One that made me laugh was from, I think it says Pollack. It says, this is definitely one of the best tennis podcasts around, other than the fact that they are super funny, like the Top Gear guys 15 or 20 years ago, before they became too full of themselves. Those guys understand tennis and bring an honest and blunt view of the tennis world. Highly recommend if you had enough of the traditional tennis media and are looking for something more meaningful. Thanks very much, Jay Pollack. I really appreciate that. Although I've never modelled myself on the Top Gear guys, so I don't really know how to deal with that comparison. But thank you very much, nevertheless. And one from Claire Bow. Just says, love this tennis podcast. Find myself literally talking, agreeing, disagreeing, and laughing along to it. Love their views and discussions, and love the fact they also review the up-and-coming British stars and their results. There are a few more, but I don't want to spend the whole podcast reading out praise of ourselves because it'll just make us get a little bit big-headed. But if you do want to leave us a review, please do so. I'm told that you can now leave reviews on Spotify, which is quite new. So if you're a Spotify listener, I know there are quite a lot of you out there, and you've not managed to leave a review before, please do try. I don't fully know how, but if you head over to Twitter at LoveTennisPod, I did post something a couple of days ago, and I'll post it again, which tells you how to do it. So thank you very much to everyone who's done so already. We look forward to hearing from many more of you. If you do want to just send us an email, because you've already given us a rating and it's 5 stars and nothing you can do about it, it's lovetennispod@gmail.com. If you've got questions, comments, queries, or you just want a bit of a chat, I was enjoying talking to Miles Hutchison from Hebden Bridge the other day about Hebden Bridge, because it's one of my favourite places in the world. Anyway, that's quite enough from me, James Gray of iNews and iNewspaper. I'm joined as always by Calvin Betton, our resident tennis coach. We have apologies from George Belshaw this week. He's recovering from meniscus surgery, which I'm told has left him high as a kite most of the time and largely unable to really offer too much insight. So he is going to be a listener rather than a podcast this week, but we wish him the very best, of course, and I know that you will all hope that he's back fully fit and firing next week. We've got loads to get through today, of course. We'll talk about Emma Raducanu and her split from Torben Beltz. We'll look at Wimbledon and their ongoing spat over banning Russian players. Roger Federer's announced his comeback. Rafa Nadal is making his comeback. Iga Świątek has gone out. Naomi Osaka has come back in, although she may be out shortly as well. Calvin's going to talk us through what difference altitude makes in tennis. We'll talk about Holger Rune as well. And, of course, Boris Becker. There is only one place to start, though, really. It is the Emma Raducanu news. She split with her coach Torben Beltz really just a few days before the Madrid Open. She said it was a tough decision, said he has a huge heart. I've enjoyed our chemistry during time together. I feel the direction for my development is transitioning to a new training model with the LTA supporting in the interim. She's got head of women's tennis at the LTA, Ian Bates, out in Madrid with her, who was, of course, in her corner in New York as well, alongside a couple of others. We heard a little bit more from her, Calvin. I know this is something you hinted that you had heard might be in the works, so we should congratulate you for getting one right, because we certainly let you know when you get it wrong. She's talked about this new training model. It sounds like there's going to be lots of different voices, and that maybe a permanent coach isn't the answer that she's going to go for.
Yeah, it seems that way. And then she hinted, I find it quite bizarre. She hinted that she's just going to focus more on sparring. She said she's going to focus more on sparring going forward. I don't really know what's new about that training model, because most of the female top 100 players try it with not much level of success on a yearly basis.
When she says sparring, I mean, we know it from a boxing context, and in boxing it really just means fighting people in training. What does she mean by sparring? Lots of practice sets, that kind of thing?
It's not really even practice sets. It's more, it could encompass practice sets. It's more just hitting. People have started using the word sparring over the last 5 or 6 years. It's just hitting. And this is one I was talking with somebody earlier and discussing this. I don't get why she thinks that sparring she's going to do more sparring instead of having a coach.
Yeah,
it's something you do with a coach or with a coach there. It's like a football team saying they're not going to have a manager because they're just going to go into training every day. Like it's something that you would do with a coach, and your coach would feed back, offer advice, ask questions, and that kind of thing while you're doing it. So it's not one or the other. There's absolutely no reason for it to be one thing or the other.
I don't suspect we'll be seeing anyone dropping any balls in front of her anytime soon, a la whoever it was last Torben's early sessions, the drop ball drill. She said something quite interesting that I think you might be able to sort of illuminate us on a little bit. She said, it's becoming more apparent to me as I spend time on tour how important it is just to get used to these girls' ball speed. I imagine that must be, maybe the biggest. I mean, it seems really obvious, and maybe this is just kind of talking in lay terms, but people hit the ball harder at a higher level, and presumably that does take some getting used to.
Yeah, listen, I always think that it always feels like I'm having a pop at her all the time when I have these discussions, but she's US Open champion, right? You can't be coming and going, I need to spend more time getting used to how hard these people hit the ball. Won the US Open, played 4th round of Wimbledon. I don't.
And she also she hits a massive ball herself.
Yeah, she's a big ball. Who's gonna? Naomi Osaka hits a huge ball, right? Who has she lost to recently? Who's blown her away with just having too much power for her?
Well, I suppose you would say she lost to Świątek 4-4, fairly convincingly.
But Świątek's not a huge ball striker though, comparatively, like Osaka would be, and I guess like Kvitova would be, or somebody like that. So I don't get, and how's she getting this? What she'll be what she'll be going with, because all the female players tend to do it. She'll get a male hitting partner, say, and most males tend not to hit the ball like most females.
Right. So in terms of because the ball flight, because the way the power is kind of, what do you mean by that?
The most females hit the ball flatter than the males.
Right.
The rallies tend to be shorter. So again, this is something that you see a lot with female players when they want this idea of the normal sort of timeline is they'll hire a coach, an experienced coach, and they'll also get a hitter in because female players tend not to practice with each other, whereas the male players will tend to practice with each other, but the girls don't for one reason or another. So they'll bring in a male hitting partner who will travel with them full time. And then usually what happens is the player will fall out with the coach and decide they don't need a coach now, they just need the hitting partner, and the hitting partner becomes the coach. And then the coach, when they split from the hitting partner, that hitting partner stroke coach then becomes the coach of another female player, and he's now a coach, and they hire a hitting partner, and the timeline continues and continues.
So this is how coaches are born.
Yeah. If you were a mildly unsuccessful male tennis player, you probably got a good shot of being a female tennis player's coach somewhere down the line.
Sounds like something you should try and tap into here, Calvin.
But I will say, what I will say though is that the most successful female players, Osaka, Serena Williams, Halep, Krejcikova, Świątek, Sakari, they've got proper coaches. They're not taking hitting partners around with them as their coaches.
Yeah. On that kind of point, she's talked. Obviously, we know she was up at the Riccardo Piatti Academy early on in the clay court season. Spent a week there. We were assured by the Raducanu camp that this had nothing to do with any kind of change that might be in the works. Although, of course, that turned out to be something of a mistruth, as you might say. Do you think that if she has, let's say she has a full-time hitting partner, but also has people coming in and out, and there are 6 or 7 different coaches who spend a week or 2 weeks on court with her over the next 8 or 9 months, is that such a bad thing? Is that quite a positive approach to trying to garner lots of different types of knowledge?
I wouldn't do it. If I was a coach, I wouldn't be involved in having other coaches there as well. I don't, if somebody goes, right, I'm going to have you as one of my coaches, and I'm going to have another 7 coaches as well, you'd think, well, why are you doing that? I don't see any sense in it, to be honest.
But is there any sense in spending, say, a week on court with Patrick Muratoglu? Well, I know you think there's always never sense in spending a week on court with Patrick Muratoglu, but with someone like him, and then going and spending a week on court with someone else, and then
people have done that, sure. People have done that kind of thing. And you may think, she may get on well with a certain coach, and I think we're getting to the stage with Raducanu now where there's so many changes, and I've seen players like that before in person, and I don't know Emma well enough to know. I'm making an assumption here that basically players who change coaches that often, they tend to have 2 personality traits. They tend to like to be told what they want to hear, and they tend to want to blame somebody else when things don't go well. And I kind of get the feeling that that's where we might be at with Emma at the moment.
But as you say, it's kind of, there's a little bit of guesswork involved there. What I've read a lot, and what I've heard from colleagues and people who know the Raducanu camp well, and there are plenty of people who know it better than I, is a lot of this is being driven by Ian, her father. We know that he's got some unusual views on tennis. There was a time when he was looking at recruiting different coaches for different shots. I suppose it's unsurprising that he's heavily involved in her career, given that it's her first year on tour. She's still a teenager. He's always been very involved. We see a lot of fathers on the WTA for better or for worse in players' boxes. I mean, does that chime in with things that you hear, Calvin?
Yeah, her dad, and she has so many agents. I know, I was told by a couple of British male tennis players last week that they'd received text messages off one of her agents asking if they would want to go and hit with her. And the rate, which I've got to say wasn't great, the hourly rate which they were offering for somebody who's ranked 11 in the world. And I'm also led to believe that Piatti was in the mix to be the coach, and they couldn't come to a financial agreement with him. And I'd say that's a bit concerning. If this
it's a familiar story as well.
Yeah, we had the issue with the physio, didn't we? Where she couldn't have the physio. She didn't have the physio with her at some of the tournaments because she said she couldn't afford it, or that was the feeling that. Not she said that. I'll correct myself there, but they didn't want to spend the money on it. And if you don't want to shell out for the coach, and like I say, the lads who I know who were asked if they would go and hit with her, but they replied saying that they'd want more money than what they were offering.
Is there any chance? I mean, you're also kind of having to predict your sources a bit here. Is there any chance there's also a bit of like, well, I know she won $2.2 million playing tennis last year, so I know there's more money there.
No, the hourly rate that they were offering for hitters was not high. These guys would get that hitting with junior, would get more than that hitting with juniors at their local club. Right. And look, there is a going rate for coaches that if an annual salary rate and a percentage incentive rate, and from what I'm hearing, that the Raducanu camp are not reaching what the rate that the other top 20 women players are paying their coaches.
Interesting. And I suppose, to play devil's advocate to an extent, that's their right. If they think that they can get by with the LTA, who will provide support to Emma Raducanu, because that's part of their brief, although that support won't last forever. If she becomes a solidified, top 10, 15 player, then she won't necessarily receive that LTA support. But if they feel that they can get through with, the likes of Ian Bates, you'll know him well, Calvin. He's not a mug. He's been around the block a lot. He's someone who knows his tennis, right? Yeah,
he's a good player. He's a good junior. He knows his tennis. He's not been on-court coaching a whole lot other than Fed Cup or Billie Jean King Cup in the last few years. But, he knows Emma pretty well. He will have done a lot of work with her through the age groups and that kind of thing. So,
and probably I always think as well, nice to have a familiar face. That I think that always makes a difference, but also someone who was part of the New York journey. Who was part of that US. I know he wasn't the coach, but he was in the box. He was part of the team. certainly for the latter stages. And I sometimes think there's a little bit of kidology, tricking yourself into thinking you've got the team that you had to win that big title in your box.
Yeah, I think also what's strange is that she's sacked her last 3 coaches on the back of her 3 most successful tournaments in the last year. Yeah. You think she got rid of Nigel Sears after Wimbledon, 4th round. She got rid of Andrew Richardson after US Open when she won it, and I think this was the first quarterfinal she's made since then, wasn't it?
Certainly her best run.
Yeah.
Yes, very odd. Well, anyway, she may be about to kick that out of the wall. I mean, on that basis, Calvin, she might be about to sack Ian Bates because she's going well in Madrid. She beat Teresa. She beat Teresa Martinkova 7-6, 6-love. She then has just beaten today Marta Kostyuk 6-2, 6-1, which is a dominant result to say the least. Really quite impressive scoreline. She played Kostyuk obviously last year in Transylvanian Open and was beaten quite heavily there. 2-1, I think, the same score the other way around. Calvin, a little bit of sign of progress, that, isn't it? To turn up and pace someone like Kostyuk, who used to smash her in juniors, I happen to know, and also is an up and comer in the game.
Yeah, I saw her play a bit last week. I thought she looked pretty good. Definitely the best she's looked since the US Open. Raducanu. She's still got some issues, I think, closing matches out. That's the one area you think she looks really good and then somehow doesn't seem to finish them. But she started doing that more, but it helps when this week, the girl basically Martinkova just pied off the second set completely. But yeah, I thought she looked pretty good. Thought Emma looked pretty good this week. She seems to have stopped losing to the girls who are ranked 100 to 50.
Yeah.
At the minute, and now it's the top 50 girls she's got to start getting out a ton on top of.
Yeah. The draw is opening up for her a bit as well. She was down to meet Garbiñe Muguruza in the 3rd round, but she was spanked by Annalena Kalinina in a bit of a shock result there. Although I did actually watch Muguruza against Tomljanovic, and I wasn't totally convinced by her even in a straight set victory there. Should she beat Kalinina, then we're starting to look at potentially Elena Rybakina, which would be a rematch of that incredibly one-sided encounter from Australia earlier this year, although that was pretty much fresh out of having COVID over the winter, so maybe not very representative. Bianca Andreescu might be in her quarterfinal or somewhere around there, so a semi-final, I should say. So, there are chances here for Emma to go deep, and there are a lot of naysayers. As you say, Calvin, it does feel sometimes like we're always criticising her because realistically, there's lots to talk about, and often there's lots of positive stuff, but when there's negative stuff, we'll say it as well. It would be amazing if she, in her first clay court Masters event, found herself in a semi-final. I think that would be an extremely good set of results to get that far.
Yeah, I say we're always criticising her. I'll come back to it again, though. She is US Open champion.
Yeah.
And I keep saying it, once you do that, you lose the privilege of being called a novice.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people on social media keep on saying she's just a novice. Right? You don't get that when you've won a major championships.
Yeah.
That's the privilege that goes. So I think it's not so much criticising her as holding her to high standards, which I think she would hold herself.
Yeah, agreed. And also, I say this often to people when they say, why don't you talk about how... It's a bit like saying, why don't the news report all the buses that arrived safely today? Why do you just report the one that crashed? There's only so much you can sit and say about, God, how good was she to beat Kostyuk? Yeah, she did play really well, and I happily give her credit for that, but I don't know how much I can add to Emma Raducanu, served pretty well, didn't ever really look uncomfortable against Kostyuk. Great, So I think there's a lot to talk about there. But I think that's also why, you, the listener, enjoy us, and I think that's why there are so many of you coming to listen to this podcast. So, yeah, I don't think we'll stop. Let's move on before we get ourselves in trouble. The Wimbledon Spring press conference gave me an opportunity to get my suit out and head down to SW19 last week. It's usually a very stuffy affair and not very much is said, and we argue about the price of strawberries and how much prize money there is. But of course, there was never any danger that we were going to be talking about any of that. Almost every question in what was a 40-odd minute long press conference was pertaining to Russia and Belarus, I should say, one way or another. They explained their decision a bit more to ban Russian and Belarusian players, which we of course talked about last week. And if you haven't heard our podcast on that, I would recommend you go and listen to it. Not necessarily because I think it's brilliant, although I do, but because we won't necessarily go back over all that ground today, and it's worth hearing what we had to say. What Wimbledon mostly seemed to say was that they felt they had no choice but to ban the players, basically because of what the UK government had said. Ian Hewitt, who's the chairman of the All England, said within the framework of the government's position, there is no viable alternative to the decision we have taken in this truly exceptional and tragic circumstance. To kind of explain that, I've spoken to a few people involved in this decision and kind of how it was come to. That they had long conversations with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, who govern sport in the UK, indirectly and directly with the Secretary of State, Nadine Dorries, who a lot of people don't like, and I'm kind of on board with that. But, she is in charge, unfortunately. And several other really high-ranking officials. They took a lot of advice on this. And DCMS came up with this advisory, which was undersigned by a lot of international bodies and a lot of international diplomats. It basically called on sporting bodies to, and the quote is, ban individual athletes selected by Russia and Belarus, including those representing bodies, cities or brands that are effectively representing Russia or Belarus. And so Wimbledon kind of took the reading of that as well. They're not automatically qualified now. So they said to themselves, these Russian and Belarus players are not automatically in. And once they sort of took away that automatic qualification, if you like, and said to themselves, do we actively allow them in, or do we kind of like actively ban them? I think they say they feel they had no real option but to do what they did. It should be noted that Wimbledon and the government have always been, certainly in the last couple of years, really strongly aligned on these big issues, on COVID, on vaccines, and obviously now on Russia. It's an organisation with very strong links to the Conservative Party in a number of different ways and through a number of different people. So I suppose it's not a surprise, because sporting bodies always need government on their side to see what they've done and how they've gone about it, and they know which side their bread's buttered. But they have to keep the government on side, and I think this was a joint decision that, frankly, not that they were happy to make, and they stressed that a lot, but that probably chimed in with what they felt was right, albeit they also think that they were kind of backed into a corner over it. Calvin, I know you've strongly said that we shouldn't be banning these players. Does any of that change any of your mind on it?
No, not at all. I get that it's difficult if the government are saying that they have to, or advising that that's what they do. But the whole thing that we heard at the start of all this was that Wimbledon could ban them by themselves because it's the only one of the majors that isn't run by the governing body of the country, and therefore doesn't have links to the government of the country implicitly, I guess. And that's now, it's now being said that that's not the case. It's the government who basically strongly advise them on what to do. The only thing I'd say is, if Nadine Dorries is advising you to do something, I'd generally go for whatever the opposite is.
Yeah, I know we have a lot of listeners in the US who will probably think that they have cornered the market on like post-apocalyptic and potentially parody politicians. Watch some Nadine Dorries clips on Twitter and tell me that she's not some sort of actor doing an intense performance piece, because she really does strike me as something straight out of the Trump administration. But
I don't know as well. I don't know how involved she was, but one of the things that she does do is she's quite threatening to any sort of organisation that doesn't entirely agree with what she says, as we've seen with Channel 4 and with BBC on sometimes. So I don't know whether she tried that with Wimbledon.
Yeah, I don't think it's unfair. Like, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to speculate. I think the government have been pretty clear, with people, as you say, the BBC, Channel 4, the National Trust, for example. They've been pretty clear that if you fall out of line with them, they will make your life extremely difficult. And they have a massive majority. They have a huge public backing, and they're not afraid to crack a few eggs to make a weird omelette. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that conversation was pretty one-sided and my way or the highway. Rafa Nadal's on your side, Calvin, you'll be glad to know, even if Nadine Dorries isn't. He said this week, I think it's very unfair on my Russian tennis mates, my colleagues. It's not their fault what's happening in this moment with the war. No. I don't know how much more there is to say on this, other than the developing news and what will happen in the next couple of days is that the ATP and WTA will have their say. This was something that, again, I spoke to a few people around this, and I know that the organisers in the UK thought they would hear something from the ATP and WTA beyond their statements, actual action, in the last few days. That didn't happen. We thought we'd have something by the weekend. That didn't happen. So I went and spoke to a few sources within the tours, and they were fairly coy. Sources are not always hugely open with me, but they were fairly coy. And they said, we're taking a bit more time for planning purposes. Now, you don't plan a no comment. Like, you don't need 4 days to plan to do nothing. Calvin, it was a pretty ominous couple of text messages that I got. Is there any chance that the tours are going to pull, and this is what we think, this is what they're threatening to do, is pull ranking points from Wimbledon and all the British events? Is there any chance if they do that they then also put on a load of last-minute events in that 3-week period before Wimbledon so that players have other things to go and play? Is that what they're planning, maybe?
I don't think you'd have time to do that. I don't think you'd have time to plan it. Although I do think it's certainly logical to pull the ranking points. The tennis rankings work on the basis that everyone can play the same amount of tournaments. And if you're taking some out, then you're immediately... It's not just those tournaments. That this is the thing what I don't know if some people understand. It's not just Wimbledon that you're not getting ranking points for. Wimbledon, because of the rolling ranking system, what happened at Wimbledon can affect your ranking. That can then affect where you get seeded in Cincinnati, which can affect where you get seeded in Montreal, which can then affect where you get seeded or whether you qualify for the US Open, etc., etc., etc. Going into effect, especially with a slam, and 200 to 500 the week before it in at Queen's. And again, we come back to it, like, what happens next year? How long do you run this for? And as well, I think something that, Nadal sort of makes a fair point there, which is the tennis players are friends with each other. And if they don't have no cross to bear, Rafa Nadal has no cross to bear with Daniil Medvedev. Roger Federer has no cross to bear with Karen Khachanov or anything like that about a war. So they sit in the locker room, they'll get some texts, and it's going to be tough to see your mates' careers basically go down the pan, because this could go on we could be in this situation for another 5 years.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we said last week. And as I say, I'd urge people to go back and listen to that. Is that, it is hard to know when this is going to stop and how you find a way to. There's so much to say on this, and we always value your views. So do let us know what you think at Love Tennis Pod. What would you do if you were in charge of the ATP Tour or the WTA Tour? How would you play it? I know a lot of people on Twitter have been pretty vocal about not wanting to ban these players, but how would you handle it? Let us know at Love Tennis Pod on Twitter. Coming up next, we're going to talk about Roger Federer briefly, Rafa Nadal too, because both of those have announced their comebacks. Unfortunately, there is a world number one, though, who won't be playing in the next week.
50 love.
This year's NBA playoffs are going to feature a lot of great rookies, and FanDuel wants you to be one of them. Make your debut on FanDuel Sportsbook with promo code ROOKIE, and your first bet is risk-free up to $1,000. So you can bet the point spread, grab the money line, or build a same-game parlay. And if you make a rookie mistake, FanDuel will give you up to $1,000 back in site credit, so you can take another shot. Okay, this guy's got potential. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up and unlock your risk-free first bet up to $1,000. We're looking forward to seeing what you're made of.
21 plus in President Virginia. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
50 all.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis podcast with me, James Gray, and him, Calvin Betton. George Belshaw sends his apologies from a hospital bed with a repaired meniscus, but he will be back next week. Speaking of repaired meniscuses, Roger Federer has confirmed his plan to play in Basel at the Swiss indoors in the autumn. Perhaps unsurprising, given it is his home tournament, of course. But it does mean we probably won't see him on tour before then, you would think, although he will be at the Laver Cup in London in September. If he does play Basel, it'll be his first match in 15 months. You could say he hasn't been fully fit since February 2020. Comeback is probably a bit of a token effort now, Calvin, isn't it? This is, we can't possibly believe he's actually going to be the real deal. This is just, exhibition stuff.
I think even for him, it's probably sailed, hasn't it? Now, I mean, it's a bit weird. I mean, to be honest, I always heard that this is how we would go. He wouldn't. There wouldn't be a farewell tour or anything like that. He just wouldn't play anymore. And I'm given now to think that that's probably what he will do. Basel, I would think. Laver Cup, he's definitely going to play in, isn't he?
Well, I wonder if he might not play in the Laver Cup. I think he'll definitely be there, and he might play doubles or something.
Well, they've said, haven't they already said him and Nadal are going to play?
Oh, they said that. They said they were both going to play. I'm not sure whether they said they're both going to play doubles. Yeah, I can't see him playing singles in September. I mean, it's kind of staggering as well. Like, we don't really know the full extent of the injury, but it's staggering how long he's been out. Like, it's actually it's pretty crazy. But I suppose when the body is that old, it takes longer to recover.
As well, even before he was out, he wasn't anything like, was he? If you look at last year's Wimbledon, it wasn't. He didn't look fit, did he?
No, exactly. So, yeah, by then it'll be 2.5 years, and we're not really talking about a proper comeback. We are, though, talking about a proper comeback in the case of Rafael Nadal, who is playing in Madrid this week. He's in action on Monday. We don't obviously know, because today is Sunday, the result of that match, but I think he's playing on Tuesday anyway, as it is. Who's he even drawn? I don't think we even know who he's going to be playing. It's a kind of crazy thing about recording on a Sunday, but that's it is actually what we're supposed to do, is record on a Sunday. Anyway, I'm waffling. He is back in Madrid. We weren't sure we were going to see him. He's got a tasty old draw. If he gets that far, he might have Carlos Alcaraz in the quarters. He might also have Novak Djokovic in the semis, which would be quite incredible. He was talking about this rib injury where he had a stress fracture of the rib. He said, "I'm recovered. I feel good. Talking about my tennis game preparations, it's a completely different story. Anyone who's had a broken rib knows how limiting it is, very painful, especially in the first weeks. I wasn't able to do anything without a lot of difficulties and even to fall asleep because of the pain. I've improved compared to when I came here, but I still have ups and downs because it's been a long time without being in these kind of situations, and it's going to be a difficult week for sure." Says he expects to be fit and competitive for Paris. Calvin, he's potentially going to go play Rome, although that obviously depends on how Madrid goes. It sounds like he's a bit undercooked, but desperately wanted to play in Spain. Is he the kind of guy who needs matches coming into... I mean, obviously it's Roland Garros and it's basically his backyard, but, would it concern you if he played, say, one competitive match before the French Open?
No. I think I said this about Djokovic going into the Australian Open as well. The thing with the slams, you get the opportunity to play yourself in. So I think if he goes to the French, you're then going, if he comes through the first 3 rounds, I think he's going to be all right. And I think even if he doesn't play another match before the French, I don't see who's beating Nadal in the first 3 rounds.
No, because of course he'll go in as a top 4 seed, so he'll avoid anyone half decent until about the second week, as it is. I suppose there are a few floaters, albeit, I mean, heck, if he drew someone like Holger Rune, who he could very much get in the first or second round and in a bit of form, but I suppose you've still got the problem of turning up to Roland Garros and you're asking someone who is ranked outside the top 40 in the world to try and beat Rafa Nadal on the court that he basically owns.
He also, I mean, there might be some listeners saying that I always bang on about match practice, and now I'm contradicting myself there. But Rafa Nadal seems to be the only player in the history of the world who match practice has no tangible effect on. The guy comes back from injury and wins slams in his first tournament. But yeah, and he's not getting worried about playing Holger Rune in the first round. I know that.
All right. Well, I mean, Holger Rune might disagree, but he usually would.
Yeah.
So it is a stacked draw on the ATP side. I mean, the Alcaraz matchup we've already seen. I feel like Nadal-Djokovic, we talked about that rivalry, and it is one of the greatest rivalries in tennis possibly ever, and how Djokovic has kind of dominated it, certainly had dominated it in recent years, and then over pretty much since the beginning of the pandemic, they've kind of split it. I think Nadal obviously winning the French Open in 2020. They played that brilliant final in Rome last year, which Nadal also won, and then obviously Djokovic beat him in the semis of the French last summer. Given everything, the injury, the time off for Djokovic, who do you think would have the upper hand going into that semi-final, assuming they both make it through relatively unscathed?
You'd have to make Nadal favourite, I think. I couldn't. Djokovic hasn't beaten anybody like anywhere near as good as Nadal, and Nadal's not been out on a long-term injury. He got to the final of Indian Wells.
He did indeed. We await with interest to see what shape he's in. It'll obviously be his first competitive match since then. Sunday the 20th of March was the last time he played, and he lost to Taylor Fritz in that final, and he was actually already hampered at that point by that injury. We could see him struggling with the pain. Speaking of injuries and potential and French Open champions, Iga Swiatek is not playing in Madrid this week. She pulled out with a right shoulder injury. She still expects to play the event in Rome, which you might argue is a better preparation for the French Open anyway, because the conditions are far more similar to Roland Garros in Rome than they are in Madrid. Calvin, do we think this is anything more than a tactical rest, if you like? She's played a lot of matches in recent weeks and probably doesn't need a whole week in Madrid.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. Without having any inside information, she might have a niggle, might be a bit sore or that kind of thing. She's played a lot of tennis, though. Doesn't need more matches. And as I think we're going to discuss later, not sure that Madrid conflates with the French Open or any other clay court tournament enough to say that you have to play there, really, does it? Yeah.
She pulled out after the draw had come out, which obviously is never great. It seems a bit unusual as well, like that was the one thing that I looked at, and because I was with you, Calvin, I thought, you know what, there's no real danger, this is an actual injury. But then I kind of thought about it a bit more, and knowing the person that Swiatek is, she wouldn't have wanted to make life difficult. And am I right in saying that there's a limited number of times you can do that in a year?
Yeah, before you start losing, I mean, you get fined, but I don't think the fine's really going to affect. She won't really going to bother her.
Iga Swiatek is the leading tennis player earner in both tours. She has made more money this year than any player, man or woman. So she's probably not that bothered by a $20,000 fine.
Yeah, but then you get into the realms of, I think you can take a suspension as well, but she's definitely not going to do it enough times for that to happen.
No, exactly.
That situation, you just walk on court, and even if you've got a broken leg, so if you've got a broken leg, you're not going to be worried about a 1 week suspension, are you?
No, exactly. She did do it. I mean, it is the second time she's done it in this swing. Actually, she did it in Charleston after she won the Sunshine Double. Again, kind of the same. I think no one was really questioning that she was actually injured because she then came to Europe and looked $1 million. Nevertheless, it kind of made me think that this, clay court season, it is a lot, isn't it? Like, you've got 3,000. Okay, you don't have 3 for the women, but for the men, you've got 3, not quite, but not far off, back-to-back Masters tournaments on clay. You've got Monte Carlo, Madrid, obviously, and then Rome, pretty much in the space of 5 weeks. Do we really need these 3 clay court Masters all rammed in together?
It's pretty close, isn't it? Yeah. And again, I think as we'll discuss, Madrid kind of sits on its own away from the others, which makes it strange to have a Masters there. I can see the argument for and against it, to be honest.
Am I right in saying, I could be making this up, but am I right in saying Madrid wasn't always on clay?
It used to be an indoor event at the end of the year.
Yeah.
It used to be the tournament that is now Beijing, I think.
Right. Okay.
At the end of the year.
So it has kind of been crowbarred into there because it has come out of nowhere to then position itself into already quite a busy schedule.
Yeah, the Masters. No, No, I'll correct myself there. Madrid was, but the Masters, they still had a Masters that week. It used to be Hamburg.
Oh, okay.
Hamburg used to be that week, and then it was Madrid was at the end of the year, so they still had the same amount. But then Hamburg lost the Masters. Madrid became the clay court one, and they put Beijing in.
I see. Okay.
At the end of the year,
can't possibly think why they did that.
No.
Hamburg for Beijing. I assume it was just a preference thing and absolutely no financial incentives to do so whatsoever. The ATP, by the way, and I will come back to this in a much bigger way, the ATP is still planning on going to Beijing at the end of the year, which, given the level of cooperation between the ATP and WTA, which has been very high lately, it'll be very interesting to see if that holds. I mean, they're definitely kicking the can down the road at the moment, but interesting. Anyway, to talk more about the WTA draw in Madrid, Naomi Osaka, pretty much in the last couple of minutes as we're recording, has been knocked out by Sarah Sorribes-Tormo. Osaka, of course, playing for the first time on clay since that absolutely torrid time she had at the French Open last year. She beat Anastasia Potapova 3-1 in the first round, but then lost by the same scoreline, actually, to Sorribes-Tormo, who, I mean, from what I saw of it, she is someone who is a tricky customer on clay. I was discussing with you off air, Calvin, a stat that flashed up that her average net clearance on the forehand side was 134 centimetres, which would suggest that she is a pretty spinny player. And you'd think for someone like Osaka, who, and by the way, Osaka's average net clearance was 55 centimetres for a bit of context. For someone like Osaka, who's not a natural mover on the clay, who's not hugely comfortable on the surface, playing someone like that, Sorribes-Tormo, of course, being Spanish, she pretty much grew up on clay. It's a little bit of a nightmare matchup, isn't it?
Yeah, especially on that surface, yeah. But, which is something that Osaka doesn't excel at or hasn't excelled at yet. I'd still fancy giving another couple of weeks. I think that, and being fully fit, we think she may have had quite a bit of strapping on her leg, don't we?
Yeah.
So I still think I still fancy Osaka to do quite well at the French.
Yeah, she had, for people who didn't see, she had some pretty heavy strapping on her left calf. Looked like it might even have been an Achilles kind of reinforcement. She had the trainer on during the second set. Although it was interesting, and you can read far too much into this. She had the trainer on and didn't get treatment. She had a couple of painkillers, but basically didn't take a medical time out, which I don't see often. I often think with players, once the trainer's out, they're like, well, I might as well have a bit of a rub and, see if it helps. But it made me think that actually this isn't like that was a pre-existing thing, and she was just saying, well, yeah, like I've done my calf a bit and it hurts. And I Calvin, you may know the rules better on this, but am I right in saying that if you've got a pre-existing injury, you can't take a medical time out for it?
Yeah, in theory you can't, but then I don't get why anybody wouldn't say you can just go, I pulled a different area of my calf. It's, I always, that's one rule I've always wondered about, knowing the rule, why anybody would come in and go, yeah, I had it before the match. And it's not like you have to declare your injuries before the match already. So,
I'd love that if you were like you had like a full medical before every match.
Yeah. But it's true. Like even the calf, you can go, yeah, it's a different part of my calf.
Yeah.
I mean, what I will say, the calf is a nightmare. Calf and hamstring. Like if either of those, a niggle in the quad or something like that, you can play through a bit of painkiller and that kind of thing. Calf or a hamstring, if it's any sort of tear or a pull, you're struggling, and the calf can be a rough one as well. Calf and hamstrings again are both 4 to 6 weekers.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed it's nothing too serious because, as you say, she will be someone who, with a couple of weeks under her belt, should be a threat at Roland Garros. She's also someone I think we all want to see go pretty well. Apologies for stumbling there. I've just been handed a glass of wine, which is lovely. This is one of the advantages of recording on a Sunday when my missus is around to cook and bring me wine. Anyway, I'll save it for the end of the episode, shall I? Be professional. Naomi Osaka out to Sarah Sorribes-Tormo. I mean, the draw absolutely disintegrating in Madrid today, even pretty much as we speak. Paula Badosa thrashed by Simone Halep, quite frankly. Aryna Sabalenka was already out. Maria Sakkari was beaten by Daria Kasatkina in 3 sets. In fairness, Sakkari's not been terribly well over the last couple of weeks, so I wouldn't read too much into that. Garbine Muguruza out, as I mentioned earlier. Danielle Collins, Calvin's favourite player, also beaten. I mean, Anat Kontaveit isn't there anyway. Barbara Krejcikova is injured, and Iga Świątek is injured. It basically means that Ons Jabeur is now the favourite for the Madrid Masters title, and why not? She's extremely high in my clay court power rankings as someone who's got a really good record on the red dirt. Just to come back to Osaka briefly, Calvin, I heard her say something interesting this week that I think you may have an opinion on. She said she's been watching lots of clay courters, but specifically wanting to watch them in the flesh and really try and learn. She feels like she learns very quickly from spending time watching people. I mean, how valuable is that to spend time watching people work or do certain things up close and personal?
Oh yeah, it can definitely help, and especially because there's often this discussion as well with tennis, the angle that they use for tennis matches. I think overall it's the best angle to watch on the TV.
Yeah,
but you don't get the full idea of the spins and shapes and heights and variations on the ball that you get if you're watching it from lower down. It's completely different. I don't agree with the. You get some people going, "Why don't we have the low angle all the time?" Well, that would be rubbish because you wouldn't be able to see anything. But yeah, in terms of that, watching them live, to be honest, I doubt she's had a rarity of watching clay court players play. In the flesh, she's been around a lot of tournaments, but it's great that she's wanting to watch. She name dropped
Rafa Nadal a fair few times as well. I saw her. I know she's always been quite particular about lines and things. Anyway, I think it's just one of those things. But I saw her cleaning the clay off the writing that says Madrid on the court before she wandered to the service line. I thought that was a very Nadalian, and there was a fair bit of kind of whipping the racket over the head in the follow through on the forehand and stuff. So. She did mention in pre-tournament that she'd added a few things, from other players, and I wondered whether that was what she was talking about. And I remember her sitting on court with Nick Kyrgios as well. Say what you like about Kyrgios, he's got a massive serve, and she spent quite a long time during the Sunshine Swing, actually, just sitting, she was cross-legged on the baseline, pretty much, just watching him serve, which I thought was a really interesting. I think she clearly. And this is reassuring because 6 months ago I thought Naomi Osaka's career would be done. She seems to love tennis. She seems like she's a bit of a tennis nerd again. And, that might change again in 3 or 6 months. But it feels like 3 or 6 months ago she didn't want or like tennis at all. And all of a sudden she feels like a bit of a tennis nerd again, which I think is refreshing.
I think that was one of the really upsetting things, wasn't it, when she was struggling? It's not just tennis. She seems to really enjoying things.
Yeah.
And, I think she's a compelling person and character who's always interested in her interviews and that kind of thing. So it's what was quite sad about when she was not in a good place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we hope that the injury isn't a problem, and we hope to see much, much more of her over the next couple of weeks. Now, it's time for a regular feature, which I know many of you enjoy, called Minute Tennis, which is a good pun if you write it down, but of course, this being a podcast doesn't work, because it's minute tennis. It's tennis in a minute, and it's small. We want to talk today about altitude and pick Calvin's brains for some coaching insight on what difference altitude makes in tennis. So, Calvin, in a minute, why does altitude make a difference in tennis?
It makes a difference because the ball flies through the air quicker. The best way you can think about it is imagine trying to play tennis with a golf ball. It doesn't take any spin very well. The ball moves through the air quick, and it makes certain players, certain types of player more effective and other types of player less effective. And you don't see many tournaments on it because it's completely different. The circumstance is completely different from any other tournament. So it's difficult to go from a normal tournament into altitude, and it's difficult to come back from altitude into it. So I've gone well under a minute there.
Easy. I mean, I have some follow-up questions you'll be glad to know. 20 seconds short. I mean, minute tennis is getting shorter every week, but that's cost of living, I'm afraid. Obviously, Madrid is different. It's at altitude. Is it only different because of the altitude? Is that the biggest difference, or are there other factors there as well?
It's the biggest difference. I think they use a different type of clay as well. I mean, for a couple of years they had that horrendous blue clay, which is apparently completely different from any other clay. But which I don't really understand why. It's only
should just be a different color, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same as why white paint on lines is why the ball skids when it hits a line. It's just white paint instead of red or green or blue paint.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's mainly the altitude that's the difference.
And does it? I mean, Madrid I think is 2,000 feet above sea level, or 600 meters if you work in metric, which is not. I mean, bigger hills in the UK are 2,000 feet. So you wouldn't go up a hill, on the North York Moors and go, oh, a bit short of breath here, a bit puffy. I mean, are there tournaments where players do go and go, oh, hang on, I'm actually struggling physically a bit here? And kind of to that, do you know any players who've ever gone and done altitude training? Or, like, when you go up, like, 5, 6, 7,000 feet, is the tennis so unworkable that there's no point in training up there?
I don't know players who've gone and done altitude training. I know that with technology, there's new sort of things that you can do. Like I know at Loughborough University in their elite performance hotel, they've got rooms fitted with altitude air conditioning now. So basically, you're sleeping in what would be altitude,
which effectively, for people who don't know, means there's a bit less oxygen in the air, which trains your body to use oxygen more efficiently, right?
Yeah, it's to do with the red blood cells. It increases your red blood cells, which means that you exude less energy when you're doing things. You've got more stamina. So, yeah, that's kind of what it does. But, it's weird. Again, though, when would tennis players go and do altitude training? The schedule's so jam-packed that... and it's not like anything else. It's not like you'd benefit from it physically, but then you'd come out of it and the tennis wouldn't be... You could say, like boxers, for example, they go and do altitude training before they have a fight, but then the ring's not any different. Whereas in tennis, you would say the natural time to do it would be in the off-season, but then you'd go down to Australia where the courts are not at altitude, so it doesn't prepare your tennis any better.
Yeah. And is it right that different... Like, I remember in Mexico, they use different balls, basically, because of the altitude they're at. Is that right?
You can use the pressured balls. So, like when anybody who's bought tennis balls, you get a can. Obviously, you get a can and you open the can of balls. Pressureless balls.
The great noise in sport.
Yeah, pressureless balls aren't. They don't have a can opener. They're different when you hit them. They feel harder. I don't know why they're different, but it's quite a different sport.
Yeah.
And basically, the type of player who would benefit from altitude, there's a few players. Tall players with huge first serves will benefit because it doesn't matter that it's flying through the air. The ball is going down on a downward trajectory off their racket. So they benefit. Also, guys who tend to like to nudge the ball around a bit, they tend to benefit because they're still going to nudge it and they get a bit of extra pace out of it.
Right. Whereas presumably the guys who hit big from the baseline but aren't necessarily particularly tall, the ball's going to fly long quite a lot. Is that right?
Yeah, and guys who play with a lot of spin tend not to, because the ball doesn't grab the air as much.
Yeah.
So you're not getting the benefit from the spin. Guys who play a lot of slice don't like altitude because the ball's going to fly long if they're going to try and place the ball on the baseline.
Right.
Not great for them.
Okay, interesting. Well, if anyone's planning a trip to do some altitude training and play some tennis, I would be fascinated to hear from you because I think it would be... I'd love to know what tennis is like at 9,000 feet, base camp stuff. I think that'd be really interesting. We'll have to go build a court there. Anyway, of course, we are at altitude in Madrid at the moment. Brits usually don't perform well at altitude, but we cannot say that today because we went 3 from 3 in the British triple header. Dan Evans beating Federico Del Bonis in straight sets. Raducanu, as we mentioned, beating Marta Kostyuk. And then perhaps the most significant result of all, Calvin, Jack Draper beating Lorenzo Cenego 6-4, 6-3. His first win at an ATP Tour level event. 1 hour 39. It took him fairly tight first set, but then things got a little bit easier for Jack in the second. I mean, Lorenzo Cenego is a pretty handy player, Calvin, and I hear Jack's serve, I think I heard, was hitting 138 miles an hour. That feels like there's been some big advances there.
Yeah, look, again, going back to what we just said, he's a tall lad with a big first serve. It's gonna help him out, and he's a good player as well. I think I said it a few weeks ago. He's playing at the standard of somebody who's around about 60 to 80 in the world, and that type of player would probably be looking to beat Lorenzo Cenego.
Yeah, Cenego, who of course is 27 in the world and will be seeded at the French Open, so that's pretty impressive stuff. He's got Andrei Rublev in the next round, which is a match that I think is due for Tuesday, so we probably can discuss it a little bit, Calvin. How does Rublev feel as a matchup for his first, probably apart from Sinner, who obviously beat on grass, although not a surface he likes, it's probably the biggest match of Jack Draper's life.
Yeah, maybe the Djokovic one. Wimbledon.
But this feels winnable. With the greatest respect, that wasn't winnable.
Yeah. No, yeah, you'd think so, and I'm not sure how that. I say that about the type of player who like altitude, but you can never really tell. You'll get these players who shouldn't like it, but they just do. So I don't really know how Rublev would stack up on altitude. Initially, you'd think he might not be a fan of it, but with his game style, but it wouldn't surprise me if he is.
Interesting little note for Jack as well. It means he'll be seeded at the French Open qualifying. I think probably if we'd given it another 3 months, he may well have got in main draw, but he's the 19th alternate by my maths, which means that he's probably unlikely to squeeze into the main draw unless there's some sort of mass COVID outbreak at a tournament that he's not at. But best of luck, and still a few clay matches that he'll have ahead of him.
Wasn't there a suggestion that the French may take the Russian players out as well? Still,
there certainly was a brief kind of. I know the LTA were hoping the French might do that, and I think there was a frisson that now the presidential elections are out the way in France that they could do it because obviously it wouldn't be quite so controversial. So that would take out 3 or 4 players. I mean, I'm trying to think how many Russians are there in the top 100. There actually aren't that many now. Yeah. Plus, obviously, are there any Belarusians? Who's the Belarusian number one? Is it Ivashka? Who's in the top 100, but then Gerasimov is 145 in the world. So I think even we might need a few other countries to invade Ukraine before Jack sneaks in to main draw. But we wouldn't actually want that to happen, clearly. But yeah, positive week for the Brits so far. Away from Madrid, there obviously has been some other tennis going on. Holger Rune beat Alexander Zverev in Munich en route to the title there. Zverev said he was extremely nervous playing in Germany for the first time in a while. He's obviously been, as we've mentioned on the pod before, on this quite big marketing sort of push to push himself onto the German people. Not great to pick up a defeat there. Calvin, I know you think clay might be his best surface, and certainly in terms of Grand Slam performance, statistically it is his best surface. So a little bit worrying to lose a match like that and be so nervous with it. Yeah,
we'll get a real sign of where Zverev's at this week, I think, at Madrid, and it's definitely where he plays his best tennis because altitude 100% suits Alex Zverev. But yeah, not a great result losing to Rune because
he's down to play doubles as well in Madrid, and he's got Cam Norrie and Tommy Paul in the first round. Which right. I mean, Cam's obviously a very even-handed person, but Tommy can get quite rowdy. I think that match might get quite interesting.
Is he playing with Melo again? Or
he is indeed.
Right. Okay. He plays almost like full-time doubles player now, isn't he? He's been playing nearly every tournament.
I think he plays all the Masters tournaments. He certainly has this year because he played Indian Wells. He didn't play Miami doubles, and then he played Monte Carlo, and he played Madrid as well. So yeah, he seems to be taking it pretty seriously. I do wonder whether there's a bit of Davis Cup kind of in the back of his head there. Anyway, he would get into the German Davis Cup doubles pairing at the moment with Kravets and Poots. But a title for Holger Rune, Calvin. He's someone who has an extremely high opinion of himself. He's now up to, he was 70 in the world before that title. He'll be pushing up towards the top 50. In fact, he will make 45 in the world, his career highest ranking by a significant distance. I mean, he's only 19. He's one of the best teenagers in the world. Is he likely to start making a push to be one of the best players in the world, full stop?
never really thought so. I don't think I imagine he'll end up having a similar career to Casper Ruud.
Right.
I don't think he's a top echelon player, and I know a lot of people in tennis think the same as that. What he has is phenomenal self-belief, and that's I don't say, I'm not sort of saying that snidely, that he's a very, very confident lad, but he 100% thinks he's going to be the number one player in the world. I think he probably thinks he's currently the number one player, the best player in the world. But whether I think he'll as he goes up, he'll struggle that he doesn't really have the weapons to dominate the men's game.
We shall see. There's also a title this week in Estoril for Sebastian Baez, the Argentinian. They're calling him the new Diego Schwartzman because he's also 5'7", and he is, of course, Argentinian. But a decent set of results for him. Beat Francis Tiafoe in the final. He also beat on the way Cilic, Gasquet, Ramos Vinolas as well, who can be difficult to put away. So, I mean, an awful lot of credit for him, and also nice to have another young Argentine. Obviously, Cherundolo, or both Cherundolos, have come through in the last couple of years. He was a junior French Open finalist as well, so he's obviously got a bit of pedigree. I don't know if he's someone you know anything about from his days coming through, Calvin, because he's still pretty young, quite frankly.
Yeah, I didn't really know him, to be honest. I don't remember him from juniors. I guess I may not have coached any players around when he was coming through in juniors, but I've seen him play a few times. Yeah, he's as close to Schwartzman as you can probably get, being Diego Schwartzman.
Very good. There's a few other results that are worth noting from Madrid. I think I've mentioned all of them, but perhaps the one that we all said in our WhatsApp group earlier today is great to see is Bianca Andreescu absolutely thrashing Danielle Collins, and not because of any personal feelings on Danielle Collins, but mostly because it's just brilliant to see Bianca Andreescu back on a tennis court, isn't it, Calvin, and playing so well. Yeah,
absolutely. She's a superstar. If she's playing well, she struggled with injuries, and I think probably a bit of motivation as well in the last few years, but a run to win the US Open was phenomenal. The way she dispatched everybody in that tournament was quite something.
It's interesting to hear her say this week as well that she's obviously had some time off and away from tennis a little bit. She's barely played really until Indian Wells. She said she had spent some time volunteering in a women's shelter, and kind of how much she'd taken away from that, and how she hopes to maybe start one herself when she moves on from tennis. And I think it is pretty important for players to have that wider perspective of the world. We talk a lot about, and I know you've said this before, Calvin, how tennis players play tennis and that's pretty much all they do, and you sort of sometimes have to cut them some slack when they've got weird opinions about things, because how could they possibly know what the real world is like? Really refreshing to hear someone, especially Bianca Andreescu, 21 years old, to kind of be so grounded and to have a bit of real world experience. I think it's important. I think people can learn from it.
Yeah, I've always got the impression that Andreescu maybe not like one of those tennis players who I just mentioned, just sort of spoke about there, and that she always seemed to have a little bit more about her. She's kind of a bit like a hippie as well. And I sat next to her on the bus a couple of times at Wimbledon last year, and she's always got like kind of a 5% spaced out vibe to her. Which again isn't a criticism. I find it quite cool, but
a different character.
So, yeah, and sort of thing we need. And she's one of those people as well who everybody seems to like. Yeah. That nobody has anything bad to say about her. Everybody seems to be her friend. And yeah, it'd be great if she's back playing. It's a weird one. Has she ever been around full time? She kind of came from nowhere, won the US Open, and then just massive injury and disappeared off the face of the earth. Yeah. I mean, another name to throw into the mix. As usual, when we do our French Open preview, we will have to name about 30 women who could potentially win the title, because they are queuing up. I think that's all we've got time for this week. I said we'd mention Boris Becker. He's been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for bankruptcy-related offences here in the UK. He's going to serve 1 year and 3 months of that. I read today that he's going to be in Wandsworth Prison, which for anyone who lives in London will know Wandsworth Prison. It's a Victorian prison. It was built for about 150 people.
There are significantly more people than that in there now. It is not a nice place. Irrespective of what you think of Boris Becker, and yes, he did something wrong, I don't know if 15 months in Wandsworth Prison is a suitable punishment for what the man has done. But that's just my opinion. It's not great news, is it, Calvin?
I think the younger generation. I was talking with a couple of my mates who are the same age as me, and age jokes will come in from James and George if he was here, no doubt. But he was the first. It's hard to explain at the time what it was like when Boris Becker came on the scene.
Yeah,
he was huge. He was you had to see him. He was a spectacle, and he was one of those guys who you'd be playing on the street, and whatever you'd be playing, and then word would get around, Boris Becker's on, and you'd run inside to watch him. He was a true spectacle.
Yeah,
and someone of such sort of physical strength that it's a bit strange now to see him in the state that he's in and having to do this. And like you say, how he's ended up in Wandsworth Prison is like, you just don't. I don't have any words for it.
No, exactly. But I guess that's the rule of law. But I thought the rule of law didn't apply to people called Boris in this country, but that's just maybe my opinion.
I tweeted the other day saying in my lifetime there's been 2 exceptionally famous Borises, and one of them was truly brilliant at what he did for a living, and the other one should be in prison. It's not worked out in the order that it should have.
Well, maybe that's a good place to end before we get sued by the government. I mean, we slagged off Nadine Dorries and Boris Johnson in one episode. If you want nothing else from a podcast, you will get that from us. Thank you so much for listening, as always. Do leave us a rating or a review, as I say, wherever you get them. It makes a massive difference to us when you do that. And of course, do come back next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network. New to the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hi, this is Nick Hancock, and if you're enjoying this podcast, you might enjoy ours. It's called the Famous Sloping Pitch Podcast, and it's Chris, England, and myself just having fun and then not having fun talking about football. Try it.